Animals including kangaroos and koalas could be culled under powers a parliamentary inquiry wants for South Australia's Environment Minister. The Natural Resources Committee has described several species as overabundant and say they're having a significant impact on the state's environment. For more, I'm now joined by Professor Corey Bradshaw, the Matthew Flinders Fellow in Global Ecology at Flinders University. Good afternoon to you. I mentioned kangaroos and koalas, but interestingly, some of the species being talked about are considered threatened in other parts of Australia.
Yeah, well, a good example there, of course, is the koalas have been mentioned. First of all, I mean, it's probably a political suicide to consider even mentioning the notion of a cull for a species like that, even though in South Australia, koalas were introduced early in the last century. But that's clearly would be unacceptable. But there are other ways to manage things that don't require lethal control, and for example, fertility control in some circumstances. But in general, it's a very difficult task even to consider knocking down densities.
Clearly, there is an issue from the agricultural perspective. Farmers and irrigators are complaining of heavy agricultural losses. Can you just outline the impact that these overabundant species are having on the state's biodiversity?
Well, first of all, even the term overabundant is a very subjective term. There is no qualified or accepted terminology that we can use to apply to that particular value. So whether it's high densities or low densities really depends on the person who's asking the question. And a lot of the so-called damage is very anecdotal, and there are very few studies that have actually looked at the economic impacts. So when you hear about overabundant, you have to wonder who's saying that particular word and what evidence they have to support it.
It sounds as though you are against this cull, and I am aware that you made submissions to the parliamentary committee. Can you summarise your submission for us?
Well, the first thing we have to consider too is that these kinds of, if there are distributional changes or abundance changes, often they're related to other components. For example, in very hot seasons, in the dry season, in the summer, we get movement of animals from the north to the south where it's a bit wetter and a bit cooler. So you can, and as the climate continues to warm, we're going to see more and more of this sort of thing. We also do know that ever since European colonization and the increase of agriculture and irrigation, there is a higher carrying capacity for things like kangaroos or quite a few small macropods in general. And in the case of species like koalas, they tend to aggregate in areas that are well watered, that they can use the softer soil to gain their food, and that is often in public urban parks. So we're not doing very much to discourage these kinds of movements or even avoid them. So when we think about how we use the landscape, we also have to think about the species that are already there and not immediately jump to the conclusion that somehow they've become overabundant.
Is there a way to utilise these species, which are clearly causing a problem for the agricultural sector, in perhaps some new industries? And is there also the opportunity to relocate some animals, such as the koala? We know that they're existing in fewer numbers, say, in Queensland.
Well, there have been quite a few translocations for koalas on Kangaroo Island over the last few decades, combined with fertility control, but that's a very labour-intensive and very expensive venture, not to mention the fact that koalas don't translocate that easily. They're highly susceptible to stress, and they have very locally specific adaptations to the kinds of food they're eating. So you can't just take a koala and dump it in another place where the slightly different eucalypts, because they have a very specific bacterial flora in their guts that allow them to digest that food. So while it sounds like a quick fix, it's much, much more complicated. And even then you have to do up to tens of thousands of animals, sometimes over the course of a very short period of time, like years, to have any effect whatsoever on whether that's browsing damage or some other aspect of disturbance to human habitation.
Do you expect the South Australian Environment Minister will approve the culling?
Well, it kind of depends what species you're talking about. I mean, as I said, if you try to put up your hand and say we're going to cull koalas, I think you'd find very quickly that there wouldn't be very much public appetite for that. Kangaroos are already being culled both for pet meat industry as well as just density reduction. Things like fur seals, for example, people have been calling for culls for decades, if not centuries, and not just in Australia, around the world, with absolutely zero evidence to support the notion that there would be, in fact, more fish for fishermen. So a lot of this is just kind of a knee-jerk reaction without much evidence whatsoever.
Professor Corey Bradshaw, thanks for speaking to ABC News.
Thank you.